The dinner table had gone quiet the way tables do right before something breaks. I was cutting into a piece of bulgogi my daughter-in-law had made from a recipe she'd clearly practiced, and I was taking my time with it, the way I take my time with most things now. Minji leaned toward her sister Soo-jin, who was visiting from Portland, and she said something low, meant only for the two of them. I heard every word.
할머니가 천천히 드시네. 아직도 여기 있어도 되는지 고민하는 것처럼.
The old woman eats slow, like she's still deciding if she's allowed to be here. Soo-jin laughed into her napkin. Minji wore the smile she always wore for company, the one that made David's shoulders relax, because he thought it meant I was being accepted. I set my fork down. Not hard. Just down the way you set something down when you've decided you're finished pretending not to notice. Minji, I said in the same dialect she'd just used, one I hadn't spoken aloud in almost 10 years. Would you pass the salt, please? The smile didn't leave her face right away. It simply stopped moving. Her hand hovered over the salt shaker a second too long, and something behind her eyes did the math most people only do once in their lives. The math of realizing every private thing they've ever said in a room might have had a witness the whole time. David looked between us, confused, still smiling, still chewing. Nobody else at that table understood what had just happened. But I did. And so did she. To understand why, you would have to go back to 1979. Before I go further, welcome to this channel, where I share true stories of women who spent their lives being underestimated. By husbands, by children, by people who mistook quiet for weak. If you've ever been the person everyone assumed didn't understand what was happening in the room, you're going to feel this one in your chest. Subscribe because these women are only ever underestimated once. I was 21 years old when I got off a plane in Seoul with 2 suitcases and a teaching contract I'd answered from a newspaper ad in Ohio. It was 1979, and the city was nothing like anything I'd known. Narrow alleys thick with charcoal smoke, vendors calling out prices before the sun was even fully up, a language that sounded at first like music I couldn't read. I taught English to schoolchildren in Mapogu for 2 years before I enrolled myself at the Yonsei Korean Language Institute, determined not to be a woman who lived somewhere without understanding it. That's where I met Richard. He was a contractor attached to the U.S. State Department, quiet in the way competent men often are, and he liked that I could argue with a taxi driver in 3 different registers of politeness depending on how irritated I was. We married in 1981, in a small ceremony with more of my Korean friends in attendance than American ones. When my language certification came through in 1982, I didn't stop working. I took a position as a certified translator for a shipping and logistics firm near Incheon, handling contracts, customs documentation, and correspondence between Korean suppliers and American buyers. I was good at it. Not good in the way people say to be polite, good in the way that meant executives asked for me by name when a deal mattered. My last contract with that firm before Richard's posting ended and we came home was numbered as a 1990-114. A shipping agreement for industrial textile equipment that took me 6 weeks and involved 4 separate legal reviews. I remember the number because I remember being proud of it. We returned to the United States in the fall of 1990. David was born the following spring. And somewhere between diapers and PTA meetings and eventually widowhood, the language went quiet in me. Not gone, never gone, but folded away like a coat you don't need in summer. I hadn't spoken a full sentence of Korean out loud in nearly a decade. I read it sometimes in old letters, in recipes clipped from magazines I'd saved. But speaking it, using it in real time with real people in a room where it mattered, that hadn't happened since before David's father passed. So when Minji leaned toward her sister that night and said what she said, she wasn't wrong to assume I was rusty. I was. My grammar had softened at the edges, my vocabulary had drifted in places. But rusty is not the same as gone. A skill like that doesn't disappear. It waits. And that night it woke up exactly when it needed to. David has always been an easy child to love and a hard one to worry about, which is its own kind of gift. He inherited his father's quiet steadiness, the sort of temperament that doesn't raise its voice because it rarely needs to. After Richard passed, David became the one who called every Sunday, who fixed my garbage disposal without being asked, who showed up. When he married Minji 2 years ago, I wanted badly to like her. And in front of people there was so much to like. She remembered everyone's birthdays. She brought thoughtful gifts to every dinner. A candle, a bottle of wine she'd clearly researched. She complimented my cooking in front of David every single time, always just a beat too loud, always with her eyes flicking toward him to make sure he'd heard. But there was another version of Minji that only appeared when David left the room. A comment about my old-fashioned seating arrangements. A pause just slightly too long, before she'd answer a question I'd asked her directly. Small things. The kind of things you tell yourself you're imagining because the alternative is exhausting to sit with. Our Sunday dinners had become a fixture. 6 o'clock my house, David carving whatever I'd roasted while Minji arranged place settings with the precision of someone auditioning for a role. I never once mentioned that I spoke Korean. It wasn't a secret, not really. It simply never came up, and some part of me assumed it eventually would. That David would mention it, or I would over dessert the way you'd mention any other ordinary fact about a life. It never did. Which is, I've come to understand exactly why that dinner unfolded the way it did. Soojin arrived at 6:15, apologizing for traffic, and Minji greeted her at the door with the kind of hug reserved for people she didn't need anything from. Dinner moved the way it always did. David pouring wine, me setting down the bulgogi, everyone settling into the small choreography of a family that had done this before. It started small. Minji switched into Korean when she spoke to her sister, which wasn't unusual. They always did, catching up on things that didn't need translating for the rest of us. I didn't think much of it at first. I passed the rice. I refilled David's water. Then Soojin glanced at me, and Minji caught the glance, and something in her posture shifted. The loosening of a woman who believes she's alone in a room even though she isn't. 엄마 좀 봐, she said to her sister. Look at mom.
맨날 저렇게 천천히 먹어. 아직도 여기 있어도 되는지 고민하는 사람처럼.
She always eats that slow, like she's still deciding if she's allowed to be here. Soojin laughed, quickly covering her mouth, glancing at David, who was cutting his meat and hearing none of it. Minji wasn't finished. She reached for her wine, took a sip and kept going, her voice light, almost fond, the way you talk about a pet who'd wandered into the wrong room.
저번에 내가 자리 바꿨다고 좀 이상하게 봤잖아. 근데 뭐라고 안 하더라.
Remember when I rearranged the seating and she gave me that look? But she didn't say anything. 그냥 놔둬, Soojin whispered. Just leave it. 괜찮아, Minji said, waving a hand, smiling that smile again, the one built for rooms, not for people.
걱정 마. 못 알아들어. 그냥 앉아서 웃기만 해.
Don't worry, she won't understand. She just sits there and smiles. I set my fork down. The sound it made against the plate was small, but it landed like something much larger. Minji, I said in Korean, in the dialect I'd spoken in boardrooms near Incheon before she was old enough to walk. 소금 좀 꺼내줘. Would you pass the salt, please? The room went still in a way I have never forgotten. Soojin's fork froze halfway to her mouth. Minji's smile didn't fall so much as it simply stopped functioning, the muscles behind it forgetting their job all at once. David looked up. Mom, he stopped. Looked at Minji. Looked at me. You speak Korean? I lived in Seoul for 11 years, sweetheart, I said, still in English now, reaching for the salt myself since no one else moved. I'm surprised it never came up. No one said anything for a long moment. Minji's hand was still hovering over the table, unmoving, as if putting it down might make the last 30 seconds real. I could have said more. God knows I had more to say, 11 years of vocabulary sitting right behind my teeth, ready to be spent all at once. But I didn't become the kind of woman who gets asked for by name in a boardroom by spending everything the moment I had it. So I picked my fork back up. I finished my bulgogi, which really was good, and I told Minji so, meaning it because a thing can be true even in a room where something else just broke. This turned out lovely, I said. You've gotten better with the marinade. She said thank you. Her voice had lost its usual polish. David kept glancing at me like he was waiting for the rest of it, the part where I explained myself or explained her, or made it easier for him to know how to feel. I didn't give him that either. Not yet. I've spent most of my life being the quiet one in rooms full of people who assumed quiet meant empty. My mother was like that. So was I for a long time before Seoul taught me that silence isn't absence. It's just information you haven't decided to spend yet. When dinner ended, I hugged David at the door the way I always do. I told Minji good night. I did not mention what I now understood about her. Not the comment at the table, and certainly not what I would learn 1 week later, about the far more expensive things she'd been hiding. David showed up on a Thursday, which was unusual enough on its own, since Thursdays weren't ours. He stood on my porch holding a manila folder like it might bite him, and when I let him in he didn't sit down right away. "I found this in the printer tray," he said. "Minji must have left it by accident." I wasn't going to look, but the top page had my name on it, so I did. He set the folder on my kitchen table and stepped back the way you step back from something you're not sure is safe. I opened it. Bank statements. 3 months of them, from an account I didn't recognize, held under a name I did, Minji's maiden name Han Jiun. Nestled between ordinary deposits were transfers, always small enough to look unremarkable on their own, always timed within a day or two of David's freelance invoices clearing. 400 here. 600 there. Small enough that David, trusting and distracted, had never noticed his own income arriving lighter than it should have. "I don't understand what I'm looking at," he said quietly, though I think he understood more than he wanted to admit. I didn't answer right away. I was looking at the routing information at the bottom of the third statement. An international wire transfer, processed through an intermediary bank in Seoul. If you've ever found the one paper that changes everything, the one that turns a bad feeling into a fact you can't unknow, comment the folder below. Because I need you to sit with me in this moment a little longer before I tell you what happened next. I turned the statement sideways toward the lamp, the way I used to turn documents when I needed better light to catch small print. And there it was, a formatting pattern in the transfer codes, the exact structure Korean shipping and logistics firms use for overseas fund routing back when I was doing this professionally. I hadn't seen that particular sequence in over 30 years, but some things, once learned properly, never fully leave you. I looked up at David, who was still waiting for me to say something reassuring. "Give me a few days," I said instead. "I think I know someone who can help me read this the right way." Patricia and I have been friends since 1994, back when she was still working as a paralegal for a family law firm downtown, and I've never once seen her rush a document she didn't fully understand yet. That's why I called her first. We sat at her kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, the bank statement spread out between us like a puzzle neither of us intended to solve quickly. Patricia doesn't read Korean, but she didn't need to. She knew exactly what questions a bank would need answered, and I knew exactly what the routing codes meant. Between the two of us, we made a reasonably competent team. Our first call was to David's bank, using his authorization, to request a formal transaction history going back 18 months instead of the 3 months in the folder. That took 2 days to process. When it arrived, the pattern held the same small, regular transfers, dating back much further than either of us had guessed, all routed through the same intermediary bank in Seoul I'd recognized from the statement. Patricia suggested we file a records request with the receiving bank as well, to confirm the account holder's name matched what we already suspected. That took another week. No urgency in any of it, just steady, unremarkable paperwork, the kind that doesn't make for exciting television but makes for something far more useful, which is certainty. Once we had both sets of records confirmed, Patricia arranged a consultation with a family law attorney she trusted, a woman named Renata Ochoa, who specializes in marital asset transparency. Renata was careful to explain in plain terms that what David and Minji had was a fairly ordinary situation dressed up as something more sinister than it needed to be. Under the law, undisclosed accounts and redirected marital income can constitute a serious breach of financial transparency in a marriage, regardless of whose name is on the paperwork. "He doesn't need to accuse her of anything yet," Renata told me. "He just needs to see it clearly and decide what he wants to do with what he sees." I appreciated that. I've never believed in handing someone a conclusion before they've earned the right to reach it themselves. So I gathered everything into a single organized file, the way I used to prepare documents for review, and I waited for the right moment to give it to David. Not the angriest moment, but the clearest one. While Renata's file sat quietly in my desk drawer, Minji, unaware anything had shifted, decided the timing was finally right to raise something she'd clearly been circling for a while, the cabin. It came up at, of all places, another Sunday dinner, only 10 days after the first one. Richard had left that cabin to David outright, a small place on Lake Winnebago where David had spent every childhood summer, and where, I suspect, he still felt closest to his father. Minji brought it up gently at first over dessert, suggesting it only made sense for her name to be added to the deed now that they were married, For practical reasons, she said. In case anything ever happened to either of us. David hesitated, glancing at me, which was reasonable, since I still held a partial interest in the property myself. I said only that I'd want to think it over. The same thing I'd have said before any of this happened. Minji's expression cooled instantly. I just think it's a little controlling, she said lightly to David rather than to me, that your mom still has this much say over everything you own. I didn't argue. I refilled her water glass and asked if she'd like more of the peach cobbler. She took the compliment as ground gained. She pressed further over the following days, mentioning the deed twice more to David, once suggesting that my hesitation was a pattern she'd noticed. She had no idea that every word she added to that pattern was simply giving David more reasons later to understand exactly who he was dealing with. I let her keep digging. Some holes are best left to the person holding the shovel. By the time the next Sunday dinner arrived, David had read Renata's file in full. He'd asked me quiet questions over the phone that week. Careful, measured questions, the kind a man asks when he's trying to stay fair to someone he still loves. I answered all of them honestly and let him arrive at his own conclusions. Dinner started ordinarily enough. Minji brought a bottle of wine. She mentioned the cabin once more, lightly testing the water. David didn't take the bait, and I watched her notice that. When dessert came, I set a folder beside my plate. The same statements organized now, English translations typed neatly beneath each Korean entry. I slid it toward the center of the table. Minji, I said calmly in Korean. 이 송금들 좀 설명해줄래?
다 같이 이해할 수 있게.
Would you explain these transfers? So everyone can understand. Her composure, the same composure that had carried her through 2 years of performed warmth, didn't crack so much as it simply gave out all at once. Her mouth opened. Nothing useful came out of it. David didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. I know about the account, Minji, he said quietly. I know how long it's been happening. I just want to understand why. She reached for an explanation, something about keeping something for herself, about not trusting how finances were handled. But the words arrived too late and too thin to hold the weight of 18 months of statements. David set down his own fork. The same quiet gesture I'd made 2 weeks earlier. We need to talk. Alone, he said. And the deed conversation is over. Nobody at that table needed me to say another word. I hadn't raised my voice once. I hadn't needed to. Things didn't resolve overnight, and I never expected them to. David and Minji are still working through what comes next, in counseling now with Renata's guidance close at hand. But something fundamental shifted that night. David calls more often, tells me things he used to keep to himself, asks my opinion before making decisions rather than after. He apologized more than once for not seeing sooner what I'd seen at that dinner table. Minji is quieter around me now, and I don't think it's fear. I think it's the particular humility of someone who assumed a room and got it wrong. As for me, I've thought a great deal about that moment with the fork, the salt, the sentence in Korean that changed everything. People have underestimated me my whole life. As a young bride abroad, as a widow, as a quiet woman at the far end of a dinner table. I used to think that was something I endured. I understand now it was never my weakness. It was simply the room I needed to do my best work. But Minji wasn't finished. A few months later, she tried something far bolder. A document with my late husband Richard's name on it. One she never expected me to read, let alone understand. If you want to see what she did next, subscribe now because part 2 is coming.